Welcome to another Jacobin talk. This one is going to be about the politics of Jordan Peterson, why, exaggerated only a little bit in the title, he's always wrong. And it's going to take a little bit of a different form as a conversation between me and my friend and comrade, Matt McManus. Matt and I are two of the four co-authors of a book called Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson. The other two are Marian Trejo, who wrote a really interesting chapter on feminism and Peterson's relationship to that, and Conrad Hamilton, who is a graduate student at Paris 8, and he wrote a really long, really in-depth theoretical section of the book. There's also an introduction by Slavoj Zizek, which I think is also, obviously we're really happy to have that. And, he says some really interesting stuff in there about the cultural moment that, that Peterson's in, and what it kind of says about the evolution of the right and how the left has failed in pushing back effectively against it. But, go read it. Before we get into it, I do want to just start by saying that on Friday there's going to be another one of these talks. It's going to be called "Why You Should Be a Marxist," and on Saturday at 1 o'clock there's the next episode of Weekends with Anna Kasparian and now Nando Vila, and Anna and Nando are going to be talking to Lee Phillips, who's the co-author of a book called People's Republic of Walmart, which I think is probably the smartest and most interesting thing I've ever read about economic planning, certainly. So I'm definitely going to be watching that. But I think the way that we're going to do this is we're going to start out with Matt, and Matt's going to talk for a while, and going to keep it a little loose, conversational. I might jump in at some point, but pretty much Matt's going to talk for a little while, and then I'm going to talk for a little while, and then we're going to have a more conversational segment. We'll also take questions from the chat, curated by producer Kale. So if you have questions that you want me and Matt to address at the end, just leave them in the comments. Matt?
Yeah, no, I just want to say I'm a little jealous. Your Zizek is better than mine with the whole nose thing and the accompanying sound effects. But yeah, no, thanks a lot for having me. I'm really excited to do this. And shout out, as you mentioned, to our other authors, Conrad Hamilton and Marian Trejo. It's too bad they couldn't be here with us today, but both of their sections are really interesting and really contribute a lot to the book as a whole. Kind of envisioned it as a complete piece, and it wouldn't be the same without them. What I wanted to start off by saying is when I kind of thought through this project originally, a lot of people ask me, well, why do you want to write a book on Jordan Peterson? What's the kind of value in doing that? And I know that you and I will talk a little bit more about this at the end, looking back on the project. But before we get into all that, I just wanted to say, first off, we acknowledge Professor Peterson's recent medical troubles, first with rehab and now having contracted COVID-19. And whatever I think about him politically, those aren't things to make light of, and hopefully he gets better soon. The reason why it is that I think it's important to write a book about him is that it can be this very worrying trend on the political left that Corey Robin, for example, has talked about very eloquently, of assuming that intellectuals who disagree with left-wing positions are just stupid or wrong. There was a really interesting example of that when Peterson first rose to fame, where he was caricatured in Maclean's as the stupid man, smart person. And while I think Peterson certainly says a lot of dumb things, and we'll get into that, and I think he's wrong about not quite everything, but almost everything, it's dangerously naive to assume that we can just kind of dismiss any intellectual who disagrees with us as simply not worth engaging in. I thought it was really important to look at his work, try to develop a sustained critique of it, and to demonstrate why some form of left-wing analysis is actually superior, even when it comes to addressing the questions that Peterson himself takes to be so important. And I'll get into that in a little while. So I had two main arguments against Peterson that I raised in the book. The first is a critique of his analysis of the left, And then a second one is a kind of argument against his own substantive political convictions. So a lot of people have talked about how Peterson has a kind of waffly or vague understanding of what left-wing analysis is all about. He usually couches it in terms of the threat posed by this neologism, postmodern neo-Marxism. And just to get a bit of a sense of what he means by postmodern neo-Marxism, here's a little clip with him lecturing on the subject matter.
What seems to me, that's Michel Foucault in the middle, and a more reprehensible individual you could hardly ever discover or even dream up, no matter how twisted your imagination. And Foucault and Derrida, I would say, there's more, but I would say they're the two architects of the postmodernist movement. And in brief, I think what they did was, in the late 60s and early 70s, they were avowed Marxists. Way after anyone with any shred of ethical decency had stopped being a Marxist. By that time, even Jean-Paul Sartre had woken up enough to figure out that the Soviets hadn't ushered in the kingdom of heaven. You know, he had evidence stretching back 45 years that he could have attended to if he would have been willing to open his eyes. Talk about bad faith, which was his ethical critique, essentially. It's something quite staggering. The postmodernists knew that they were pretty much done with regards to pushing their classic Marxism by the late 60s and the early 70s, because the evidence that Stalinist Russia, and not only Stalinist, certainly Lenin was no saint by any stretch of the imagination. The killing certainly got underway while he was still alive, and continued after Stalin was dead as well, although perhaps with not the same degree of brutality and efficiency.
So, yeah, I mean, that's pretty much, par for the course when it comes to a lot of his analysis. And there's a lot of holes that you can pick on this. Probably the most obvious one is, just as a matter of historical fact, the argument that people like Derrida or Foucault switched from being Marxist to being postmodernist because of the moral shame that the Soviet Union cast upon the Marxist tradition. It's just really odd, right? By May 1968, there are thriving communist and Marxist and socialist parties across Europe, including many parts of Western Europe. Marxism was a respected intellectual paradigm, certainly in France. There was certainly no need for them to deviate from that in order to maintain intellectual respectability. And indeed, a lot of them took their cues from France's most prominent intellectuals, people like Jean-Paul Sartre or Louis Althusser, who are avowed Marxist, or at least Marxist-friendly for a long period of time.
Yeah, I would just jump in on this and say that one of the things that's most astonishing about that is just chronologically, like this it's so weird, because there were no major revelations about the horrors of Stalinism in the late 60s. All that stuff happened in the 50s. Khrushchev's secret speech, all of that. And in fact, Sartre, who he mentions, had been a anti-Stalinist Marxist at that time, right? Like in 1956, Sartre wrote a book condemning the Soviet invasion of Hungary, and he did that as somebody who considered himself a Marxist, and as somebody who continued to consider himself a Marxist as time went on. And not only were Foucault and Derrida not student revolutionaries in the late 60s, as he suggests, but by the late 60s, they both already were academically ensconced and had written their books, laying the foundations for postmodernism. And by the way, they and Sartre were constantly sniping at each other because they hated each other because these traditions are so obviously at odds.
Oh yeah, and not only that, the weirdest irony is that both Derrida and Foucault, who are the two biggest people he points to as postmodern neo-Marxists, were much more influenced by people like Martin Heidegger, who Peterson himself reveres as a kind of major philosopher, than they were even by orthodox Marxism. And Peterson also has a really big heart-on for people like Friedrich Nietzsche, and Foucault actually said in the 1980s, "I am a Nietzschean," right? It doesn't really get much more obvious than that.
Yeah,
and there are,
as far as philosophers who are whose mantle are claimed by totalitarian regimes, or not to put too fine a point on it, nobody had to claim Heidegger for the Nazis.
Yeah, exactly, right. There are a lot of people who appropriated Marx's work and turned it to various totalitarian ends. And there's a lot of interesting stuff that you can write about that, whether there were implicitly totalitarian elements of his philosophy, or whether it was all just misinterpreted and there's none of that. But you didn't really need to do that with Heidegger, since he pretty much deliberately associated his philosophy with Nazism.
Yeah, he was literally a member of the Nazi Party.
Yeah, exactly. And we don't really see too much about that. And there are all kinds of holes that you can poke in his interpretations of these figures on that kind of basis, right? The Zizek clip that I think we'll be watching later on with your presentation pretty much makes it clear that he doesn't really have a very firm understanding of Marxism, let alone postmodern neo-Marxism. There's this kind of shocking moment at the beginning of his debate where he admits that he hasn't read anything except for the Communist Manifesto, since he was basically an undergrad, despite the fact that he talks so much about the evils of Marx and Marxism and so on and so forth. And he doesn't really address any of the arguments of these figures in any kind of sustained way. The only place where, after having read lots and lots of his stuff, he tries to do so is about 12 pages of 12 Rules for Life, appropriately enough, which is about the same amount of time that he dedicates to analyzing a single Mesopotamian myth and maps of meaning, right? So anyone who takes him as a figure who's an authority on the intellectual substance and make up the left is kind of doing themselves a disservice. But beyond, kind of all these intellectual problems, why does it matter that Peterson's made these mistakes? What's the problem beyond just demonstrating a certain level of intellectual ignorance about the heritage of the left? And the kind of argument that I make in the books that's really weird is that he doesn't seem to appreciate that a lot of the figures that he condemns shared many of the same anxieties and same worries that he did. And I think one of the reasons he doesn't like to address that is because it would problematize his own substantive political views. So for instance, take the problem of nihilism, which Peterson deals with quite a bit in his work, invoking people like Dostoevsky or Solzhenitsyn and so on. Fair enough, I don't think there's anyone out there who says we should have a more nihilistic society, right? And we can even make the argument that maybe modernity and now postmodernity is characterized by levels of nihilism. It's hugely problematic, and we need to overcome it. But nowhere does Peterson address the arguments of people like Karl Marx, or even savvy right-of-center authors like Max Weber, who are a lot more acute in noticing that, well, if you have a nihilistic society, maybe modern capitalism, which is the dominant economic form across the globe, has played some role in generating that, right? By corroding traditional ways of life, by making everything about consumption, by transforming the whole world into a series of commodities that can be bought and sold, where everything is of relative value. And he also seems completely ignorant of things like the Marxist critique of identity politics, tends to lump all these things together. And a lot of Marxists, and I think rightly so, see identity politics not so much as the continuation of Marxism by other means, but as a symptom of late capitalism's culture of individual expression. And they see identity politics in some senses highly problematic, since while it might create local achievements for different marginalized groups, that comes at the expense of structural reform or trying to challenge the economic status quo. You can look at all kinds of examples of this, for instance, the emergence of what we now call woke capitalism, right? Its embrace of certain forms of identity politics and the association with various signs of consumerism. And this is a pretty serious problem. And if you're going to address the issue of nihilism in a comprehensive way, it might be worthwhile looking at whether or not the dominant economic form that we all live in has contributed to that. And that's just not something that Peterson really wants to do. And it really does a disservice to these kinds of problems that he claims to take so seriously. And all he'd really need to do is engage a little bit with some left-wing thinkers seriously, rather than just dismissing them. And he might be a lot more attentive to that. The second thing that I tended to bring up in the book is the problem with Peterson's own substantive political views. And Peterson, and particularly his fans, are often kind of weirdly unwilling to accept or even embrace the fact that he's kind of a right-of-center figure. Usually, they try to present him as some kind of neutral prognostician of how the world is at the moment. And this is despite saying things like, well, Justin Trudeau is a really bad person because he's bringing political correctness to Canada, or musing about voting for Trump, chumming around with people like Viktor Orban and so on. And this is a pretty common tactic of people on the intellectual dark web who try to present their positions as not really substantive political convictions, or not based on substantive political convictions, but more neutral and beyond partiality that we're all enmeshed in.
The Orban thing is really worth underlining and circling a couple times for anybody who's not familiar with this. Because not like to treat it as like a cheap gotcha or anything, but I think because it's actually really revealing that, that if you're if you're going to make a big deal about, freedom and free speech and liberalism and the problems of censoriousness, when you're talking about people who you're afraid might force you to call your students by their preferred pronouns, you probably shouldn't be like literally visiting and saying nice things about and being photographed with this like terrifying far-right authoritarian leader in Hungary.
No, absolutely. And that's something that I always found a little bit odd about his work. He really shot to prominence in 2016, expressed all these anxieties about the coming totalitarianism and how it is that freedom was going to be corroded and liberal values were under attack. And apparently a lot of that was going to be coming from 20-year-old university activists, not from the actual demagogues espousing far-right views who are actually coming to power in places like India or Hungary or the United Kingdom. To a lesser extent, there's some controversy about the United Kingdom. And that's really indicatory about where his priorities lie, right? Because any person with good sense would say that if you're really concerned, as you pointed out, with the rise of anti-liberal totalitarianism or authoritarianism, chumming around with Viktor Orban is probably not the right thing to do, right? And again, there's this kind of weird habit to Trump sometimes imply that he doesn't actually have considered political views. Whenever he's really pressed on this, he'll sometimes retreat into saying, well, I'm just a psychologist and I don't actually have concerted political convictions and so on and so forth. But I don't think that's true. I think that he's best understood as what's sometimes called an ordered liberty conservative, if you want to talk about the Canadian tradition. And an ordered liberty conservative generally supports pretty standard classical liberal rights, sometimes with modest forms of welfareism attached if you live in Canada or the United Kingdom. For instance, Peterson has said that he supports things like the universal healthcare system. But generally speaking, ordered liberty conservatives are skeptical even of social democratic reforms, because I think that's leading too much towards a kind of equality that's intolerable. And they also believe that liberty needs to be buttressed by a healthy respect for traditions, a sustained religion, and the prevalence of what Edmund Burke will call things like little brigades, right? And you see this kind of ordered liberty conservatism in his insistence that before you try to change anything about society, it's really important to try to put your own life in order, and then you can try to change the world. And this is usually cast in this very waspy way, right? You need to try to accomplish something that's respectable within the bourgeois sphere. And once you've done that, you've almost earned the right to try to change things because you're now wise enough and experienced enough to have a good sense for what's possible and what's not. And there's another good clip here that we can play that kind of indicates this nicely.
Well, fundamentally, I'm a psychologist, and my experience has been that people can do a tremendous amount of good for themselves and for the people who are immediately around them by looking to their own inadequacies and their own flaws and the things that they're not doing in their lives and starting to build themselves up as more powerful individuals. And if they're capable of doing that, and then they're capable of expanding their career. And if they're capable of expanding their career and their competence, then they're capable of taking their place in the community as effective leaders. And then they're capable of making wise decisions instead of unwise decisions when it comes to making collective political decisions. I'm not suggesting in the least, and have never suggested, that there's no domain for social action. I'm suggesting that people who don't have their own houses in order should be very careful before they go about reorganizing the world.
Yeah, and I should say, Ben, you and I have kind of joked about this before. I don't think any of us on the left or elsewhere have a problem with advice like, you should clean your room, probably a good bit of advice there, or I have nothing against cats and petting them,
Yes, yeah. Petting cats is good.
Yeah.
Standing up straight and cleaning your room is good. I have had the thought that, if you've spent enough time at DSA meetings, you've probably met a few people who could stand to get more of the advice of that nature. But there's also you have a lot of pretty anodyne self-help advice, which does help people, right? Like that's also something to be clear on here that in fact, part of why Peterson has been an effective political messenger is because oftentimes people are getting something real from him, right? That there is like advice here that can actually, it's pretty basic. I don't think it's different from what you get in any number of apolitical self-help books, but it does help people, and he can be a charismatic messenger of that self-help advice. But of course, it's all linked to this it's all linked to this reactionary political agenda. In other words, it's not just clean your room, it's set your house in order before you try to change the world.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, ContraPoints, I think, made a really nice argument in her video about incels, where she said, for some of these people, Jordan Peterson might be just what they need, right? Because he's kind of got the aura of an anti-feminist old man, and he's telling them, put your life straight, go exercise and go try to find a woman. And I kind of sat there thinking to myself, she's probably right about that, right? Because I don't imagine a lot of incels are tuning into the Jacobin, even though they should. But they might listen to Jordan Peterson, and he can have some useful self-help tidbits to offer them. The problem with this, then, is a lot of times the reason you can't get your own life in order isn't because of a problem with you. It may be, but it might not be. And that's because a lot of times our problems have very social dimensions to it. And I give a number of examples in the book, but we could multiply these almost endlessly, right? But think about a worker who's not earning enough money, working at a grocery store as a cashier. And because he's not making enough money, he's not able to go to school to try to better himself, he can't maintain a relationship. One of the ways that he could seriously improve his life would be forming a union and advocating for higher minimum wage or better work conditions or better working hours, or joining a political party that's agitating for those things. And that may very well be a way of putting his or her life in order, while at the same time contributing to other people's lives, making something better for the whole. Or think of being a woman in the 1970s. And that wasn't really all that long ago. And while I was researching this video, I read about a number of cases in Canadian divorce law, probably the most prominent one being Murdoch versus Murdoch. Once upon a time, strict divorce laws meant that women weren't able to receive a great amount of the marital assets in the event that they had a divorce. While in those kind of circumstances, demanding legal reform is part of ensuring that you better your life as an individual and get your fair share after a long marriage. But it also changes society for the better by establishing more equal conditions for women. And Marianne talks a lot about this kind of stuff in her section on the book. And this is really the problem with ordered liberty approaches. They claim to value liberty a great deal, but they only want you to use liberty in ways that don't disrupt the status quo order all that much. You're supposed to use it to become personally successful, take care of yourself, and then gradually start to help those around you. And I would argue that the proper approach to freedom is to look at it not just as individual freedom, but the freedom to remake society. And in fact, to try to create a society that's more just and more fair. And actually, I would see this as consonant with what's best in the liberal tradition that Peterson himself claims to revere so much. For instance, a good liberal socialist like John Rawls, who says that if you want to respect liberal principles about freedom, you need to make sure that the least well off are cared for. And that's a fundamental moral duty you have as an individual. And it's a way that you can obtain a kind of completion while at the same time making the world better for everyone. And I guess I'll end it there, and we can have a little bit more of a conversation about it afterwards. But that's the big problem I have with his own substantive viewpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that to pick up on a couple of threads of all of that, right? Like it can. I think at a certain point we start talking about all the stuff that Peterson gets wrong, right? Which I'm going to continue to do, and we're going to continue to do. There's a sense.
Looks like we momentarily lost Ben. He'll come back.
We were sabotaged.
Yes, we were. We've been compromised. Here he is. Sorry about that, Ben. Take it away.
No problem.
The alt-right got you, right?
Yeah, or somebody was upset about your comment about incels. I don't know, one of them. but which actually on the subject of incels, you're talking about Peterson's vagueness, right? And I think this is an important point when we start to get into what's wrong with especially something I want to be a logic nerd and focus on here, which is his arguments. And the reason that I want to do that, right? Because like on some level, I think, all right, this can feel like a silly exercise because he's making all of these completely historically illiterate claims about French thinkers. He can be incredibly vague in ways that we'll get into. He has been, he's been repeatedly shown to spend a lot of time talking about subjects that that he doesn't really know anything about. So why talk about, like, why go through the effort of taking the ideas seriously and trying to break down exactly what's wrong with his arguments? And I think that there are a lot of good reasons, and I know Matt and I are going to touch on this, later on. But one thing to emphasize is that even if, before the recent unfortunate news about his personal life, his personal struggles, even if you felt like you'd heard less about Peterson lately than you had in a while, it can be very sobering to head over to the Amazon list of like the most read books of the last week or month and see where 12 Rules for Life always lands on that list. Actually, when last year, when you could still do things like this, when I visited Matt in Mexico went to a conference that he organized there. One thing that that you get in between the conference part and all of the tequila and mezcal is
my memory still hasn't quite recovered from that.
Well, my liver certainly hasn't, but in any case, is that Mexican students, who follow the news and politics, aren't necessarily familiar with like a lot of the right-wing figures that we might talk about and critique and go after, but certainly they all know Jordan Peterson, right? I don't think there was one person that weekend who I remember talking to said, "Oh, how about like, okay, do you follow this person? You know who this person is? How about Jordan Peterson?" It's like, oh yeah, they all knew him.
I used to say from Canada, Canada has 3 primary exports, right? We send out literate folk singers like Leonard Cohen, Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, shitty pop stars like Justin Bieber or Celine Dion, and with some weird recent alt-right activists or reactionary figures, Lauren Southern, Jordan Peterson, Stefan Molyneux. We got all of them. I don't know why that is. It's really weird.
Canada isn't sending us their best, but I'm sure some of them are fine people.
Yeah.
So that's one thing, like that, like it or not, right? You have to live in the intellectual world that you're in, not the one that you want to be in. Men make their own history, but not under conditions of their own choosing. But also that if you find yourself talking to somebody who does know Peterson's work pretty well and has been influenced by it, maybe in good ways, right? In terms of pulling their life together, quite often in very bad and dangerous ways politically, they take the ideas very seriously. And if somebody is just brushing him off and calling him stupid and not really addressing like the philosophical guts of the position, everybody who's influenced by Jordan Peterson picks up on that. So if you're going to counteract this incredibly successful, incredibly popular messenger of certain kinds of reactionary social views, certainly of a critique of Marxism, then you do need to take the argument seriously, even though I will admit, right, it is sometimes hard because Peterson says some very strange things, right? So we have a clip of him here, for example, talking about snakes.
Mother and father of humanity emerging from this underlying snake-like entity with its tails tangled together. I think that's I really do believe this, although it's very complicated to explain why. I really believe that's a representation of DNA.
It's complicated to explain.
And that representation, that entwined double helix, that is every.
Yeah. So the snake artwork that shows up in a lot of ancient cultures it's hard to explain, but it's a representation of the double helix structure of DNA. I think he's actually suggested in other places that this might be an insight that like shamans got from using psychedelic drugs. But
I mean, that does sound like fun, to be fair.
Yeah, I mean, if there's something that you can do that's letting you see see straight to the structure of DNA, because you're so connected to the universe, and then make awesome artwork about it, then I'm willing to be a research subject for that, right? I'm
hell
happy.
yeah. Sign me up for the weekend.
I'm happy, absolutely, right? I'm happy to take that. But I think, that said, I think it's a mistake to just blow it off, because as socialists, right, we want a more egalitarian, less hierarchical distribution of wealth and power. We want people to to have various social goods that they're currently denied. We want them to have more power over their lives, both on and off the job. And if somebody is saying the sort of heart of what Peterson's message is that, oh, these Marxists, these postmodern Marxists, sometimes we talked about that earlier, but everybody who is left-wing and annoying to him is a postmodern Marxist in his eyes. They're on this unrealistic program to rid the world of hierarchy. And of course, we can't do that because hierarchy is so deep in our DNA, and it shows up in all these myths. And in fact, it's so deep in our genetic heritage that lobsters have hierarchical behavior. Then the effect of that is to make a lot of people. This guy has a massive audience. I think we have to be real about that. He has a massive audience, and it makes a lot of people much less likely to think that the sort of social hierarchies that we're objecting to. Obviously, nobody objects to all hierarchy. That's a straw man. I've yet to meet the socialist who thinks that we should abolish basketball tournaments, because they have winners and losers, or that parents and toddlers should have exactly equal power. So if the toddler wants to walk into traffic, the parents can't stop them. But we do think that there are a lot of social hierarchies that are very bad, and that hierarchical arrangements, should be judged guilty until proven innocent. That we should have, a default to try to create a more equal and democratic kind of society. And he is a very effective messenger for the opposition. So I think that it's really worth the exercise, right, to not be too cool for school about it, to really go through the work of taking it seriously and saying, okay, right, I'm listening. I'm willing to address the arguments that you've got, and then let's talk about them. So I think a real standout example to me, this is actually the very first Jordan Peterson clip I ever saw several years ago. Right? Yeah, it's the one. No, it's the one. The "That's Not Real Communism" clip.
Yeah.
And then when the Marxists say, well, that wasn't real Marxism, what it really means, and I've thought about this for a long time, it's the most arrogant possible statement anyone could ever make. It means, if I would have been in Stalin's position, I would have ushered in the damn utopia instead of the genocidal massacres, because I understand the doctrine of Marxism and everything about me is good. It's like, well, think again, sunshine. You don't understand it. You don't understand it. And you're not that good. And if the power was in your hands, assuming you had the competence, which you don't, you wouldn't have done any better. And even if you had, there would have been someone else waiting right behind you to shoot you the first time you actually tried to do anything good.
Yeah. And the thing is, it's, if you are starting out as a convinced Marxist, it's very easy to make fun of that. You're going to have lots of material there. But I think that it's easy to forget how maybe it reads if you're not starting out as a convinced Marxist. How it reads to many people is that here's somebody who's a professor, who knows a lot about history and psychology, who, as he said, has really thought about it, who is delivering with the, Kermit the Frog voice aside, is delivering with the intensity of an Old Testament prophet about how evil and horrible Marxism and socialism are, and that that is very compelling to people.
I should add one more thing though. Like, this is the other thing, right? Like, it's very easy to chide people like Dave Rubin or even Stefan Molyneux for saying things that seem insincere and also silly, right? I don't think anybody could watch that and not get the sense that he really believes what he's talking about, to kind of draw on the rhetoric you're talking about, right? He almost seems brought to tears like an Old Testament prophet by what he's saying. And that might seem a little bit silly to us, since we know that it's kind of a weird thing to say and there's a lot of mistakes involved in it. But if, like I said, if you're listening to this and you're not somebody who has a pretty left of center opinion about this, it can seem like powerful stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very powerful to a lot of people, and I think we forget or dismiss that at our peril, right? So I think it's worth taking the time to say, okay, what's the argument he's making here, and what's wrong with it? And I think that there is something that's actually right about this. I think that the overall conclusion is very, very wrong, but the thing that's right about this is that it's silly to think to be a voluntarist about social and political structures, and think that if only you had sufficiently good-hearted people in charge, everything would be fine, right? That if instead of Stalin at the top, you have somebody more compassionate and humane at the top, things will be okay. And honestly, as far as that goes, that's correct, right? In fact, that's something that any Marxist worth their salt will agree with. That we can't solve problems with these social, economic, political structures just by getting rid of the occasional bad person at the top of the pyramid and having good people at the top of the pyramid. In fact, that is the source of some pretty powerful arguments for socialism. That if you're that we don't want to trust anybody with that kind of power, which is a good reason to be a democratic socialist, not a Stalinist, but it's also a good reason to think that it's a bad idea to have a society where some people own their own businesses. Some people have the financial resources, to start their own businesses and employ others. But most people have to rely on the first class for their livelihood, and are thus subject to the domination of the first class. That you have to go along with a lot of things you wouldn't otherwise go along with. And if you think, go with Peterson's argument there, that you're not that good, right? Lots of people are going to abuse that position of power. Even if you are that good, there's going to be somebody behind you, somebody ready to outcompete your business, say, who's willing to be more ruthless about it. So we can't just count. It's not just that, okay, every once in a while, some real bastard like Harvey Weinstein or Jeff Bezos is in a position of wealth and power, but otherwise we're fine. It's that having these kinds of imbalances of power really lends itself to those sorts of abuses. That's correct. But even aside, we could nitpick his understanding of Soviet history. It's actually not really true that anybody given the power that a Soviet leader would have would commit, quite the same abuses as Stalin. If you look at Khrushchev or Gorbachev or even Brezhnev, there are some significant differences there between that and the worst excesses of the Stalin period. But again, the core argument that one reason not to have such structures is that it could end up like this. That it could lend itself to those sorts of abuses. That's an argument, I think, that any socialist, right, anybody who wants to extend democracy, democratic institutions to the economic sphere, because we don't trust anyone with the kind of power the capitalists have over workers, could absolutely get behind. The problem is that, as with the earlier clip that Matt played about postmodernism, he's just taking it for granted that socialism equals Marxism equals Stalinism. that you can't have a Marxist position where you actually have a Marxist critique of those regimes, despite the fact that Sartre, for example, we talked about earlier, and a long list of other Marxist thinkers over the course of really most of the Cold War actually had such critiques, from Rosa Luxemburg to Michael Harrington to Trotsky, lots and lots of people, right? These people had very different positions from each other, right? But they all shared in common thinking that the core insights of the Marxist tradition were good, with one degree of revisionism or another in different cases, but that we shouldn't see the Soviet system as the embodiment of those hopes. And when he's kind of confronted face to face with it, right? When somebody really shoves in his face, hey, look, there are Marxists who clearly don't fit what you're talking about. And in fact, some of what he's talking about, no Marxist fits, right? So all the stuff about equality of outcome, if you read the first chapter of the Critique of the Gotha program, Marx actually criticizes slogans about strict equality and says what's important is that the workers are in charge of deciding how to distribute the social surplus, not that the distribution is completely equal. But certainly as far as the identification with Stalinism, that there are lots and lots of Marxists who don't fit that. In fact, he debated one of them. Slavoj Žižek is not only not a Stalinist, he was a democratic, dissident, a Marxist, but a democratic dissident in the Communist Party of Slovenia in the end of the Tito era and before the destruction of Yugoslavia. And when he was confronted with this fact at the debate with Zizek in Toronto, he says this about Zizek's relationship to Marxism.
You're a strange Marxist to have a discussion with. And, but here's why. This is not an insult by any stretch of the imagination. No. I mean, one of the things that struck me when I was looking at your work was that first of all, you're a character, and that's an interesting thing. Like
Is this an insult or not?
It's not an insult. It's a sign of originality, and it's a sign of a certain amount of moral courage, and it's a sign of a certain temperament, and it makes you humorous and charismatic and attractive, and I think you appeal to young people the way that outside intellectual rebels appeal to young people, and so those are all positive things that can be used positively or negatively. And my question is, it seems to me that your reputation, unless I'm very misinformed about this, is as a strong supporter of Marxist doctrines on the left, or was that? And so then my question is, given the originality of your thought, why is it that you came to presume at some point in your life, perhaps not now and perhaps still, that the promotion of Marxism rather than Zizekism was appropriate? Because it seems to me that there's enough originality in your body of thought and lateral thinking in the manner in which you approach intellectual ideas that there's just no reason for you to be allied with a doctrine that's 170 years old and that is, if capitalism is rife with problems, is twice as rife with problems as that. And so you're kind of a mystery to me in that way. And so that's my question.
I should say that I always think that that's a weird clip, just because he goes out of his way to compliment Zizek almost again and again and again, and then doesn't even bother to really ask himself the question, well, why would such a smart man be interested in Marxism? He just presumes that no smart person would be interested in Marxism, and then says, well, this makes you a mystery to me, right? To which my rejoinder is almost always, well, why don't you just go read the damn book, spend some actual time with it, and then maybe the mystery will reveal itself to you,
Yeah, right. And again, clearly has not done the reading, admitted at the beginning of the debate that he had just, in preparing for the debate, had read the Communist Manifesto, some man in his 40s, for the first time since he was 18. So given the Communist Manifesto will take you an afternoon to read and not a long afternoon, I think it's probably safe to say that he wasn't spending a lot of time digging around Capital Volume 3, when talking to Marxists. But there's another clip. I think we're going to skip it for the sake of time because I want to make sure we have a few minutes to take questions here at the end. But it's a very familiar one in any case, where Zizek, who was extremely friendly over the course of the debate. In fact, I think this was a really good strategy, maybe for reasons we can get into a little bit later, that basically Zizek correctly understood that Peterson fans weren't necessarily going to be hardened reactionaries, who just had to be confronted as enemies. In a lot of cases, they're confused and alienated young men who, if you could present a version of the left that was more appealing, that wasn't as bound up with certain kinds of identitarian tendencies that Peterson fans are likely to be allergic to, like many people who are allergic to that. That was going to be a much better strategy for getting these young men to listen to you, and I think that was correct. But I think that it was also a useful thing that he did push him on this point. So I guess was just chatting with Matt and the producer. So I guess we are going to show that clip. So this is Zizek asking who exactly Peterson is talking about.
Where did you find the data that I simply don't see it? Okay, let me begin by this. You designate your, under quotation marks, I'm not characterizing here, enemy, or what you are fighting against, as sometimes you call it postmodern neo-Marxism. I know what you mean, all this, from political correctness to these excesses of whatever spirit of envy and so on and so on. Do you think they are really, where did you find this data? I don't know them. I would ask you here, give me some names or whatever. Where are the Marxists here? I don't know any. I don't, who is a Marxist here? Well, show me any big names of political correctness. Well, I think they fear like a good vampire fears garlic. My problem would be with this one. What you describe as postmodern neo-Marxism, where is really the Marxist element in it? They are for equality. Sorry, where? They are for equality at these cultural struggles, proper names, how do we call each other? Do you see in them, in political correctness and so on, any genuine will to change society? I don't see it. I think it's a hyper-moralization, which is a silent admission of a defeat. Well, that's my problem. Why do you call, give me, no, it's not a rhetorical question for politely saying you are an idiot, you don't know what you're talking about. Please, I'm so sorry that I was too long.
No, that's no problem. Please. Well, I mean, organization like Jonathan Haidt's, what's it called? Heterodox Academy, and other organizations like that have documented an absolute dearth of conservative voices in the social sciences and the humanities, and about 25%, according to the what I think are reliable surveys, approximately 25% of social scientists in the US identify themselves as Marxists. And so there's that.
But where are the results?
Okay, but
can you name me one? I know a couple of Marxists.
I do never get tired of that.
No, I could watch that every day. And this is why, I mean, I really think that Zizek's approach was useful, and I think in a way that was kind of underappreciated at the time, because given what debate kind of often means now, especially in the era of YouTube, and I'm not hating, right? I do those debates too, but I think a lot of people on the left who were watching that debate really wanted Zizek to come in there and just like rhetorically crush Peterson's skull, and they were disappointed that that he didn't do it. Right? He had that moment we just watched, where he was like really pressing him, although in a good humored, nice way, but like also basically with about the affect you might expect from a kind of like eccentric, friendly, funny older professor giving a graduate student who's basically fond of a hard time about something that he was like really wanted him to admit that he had to get past because he was being sloppy. But for the most part, right, what he's doing in the rest of that debate, is kind of, killing him with kindness, right? Is saying, look, I'm not going to embody all of your fantasies about how there are these legions of postmodern neo-Marxists who want to put you in a gulag for not knowing, all of the different pronouns. And then when you get out of the gulag, you'll get one crust of bread a day, and we'll measure it with a little measuring stick to make sure your crust of bread isn't any bigger or smaller than anybody else's crust of bread, because we want strict equality. I'm not going to do that, right? Instead, I am going to gently explain that a lot of this doesn't make a lot of sense, that that you're talking about this category of people that you're supposed to be fighting against, these postmodern neo-Marxists, that's so poorly defined that I literally have no idea what you mean. And I'm also going to like be Zizek about it and tell some dirty jokes and generally show your audience that I have very little resemblance to the fantasy that Professor Peterson is putting forward here.
No, I thought it was a very clever thing to do, right? Because what a lot of these right-wing commentators do is present the left as a monolith. And if anyone's ever spent any time on the political left or leftists, right, you know that that's not true. We love nothing better than to gather around in a circle and talk about why we all don't like one another, which is too bad, really, in some ways. But the minute he came across not as this kind of monolithic antagonist, but as somebody who was smart, funny, pretty down to earth, and actually had some really interesting and provocative things to say, I think it dispelled a lot of the mystique that Peterson tried to associate with postmodern neo-Marxism, so-called. Once that was gone, he really had to try to rely on the quality of his arguments to actually make the point. And at that point, really all it was a matter of doing was almost letting him fall on his own sword, just the way that Zizek did there, right? Well, naming who some of these people are, right? Well, I don't know, there's a bunch of the neo-Marxists in the academy, and they must kind of think the same as everyone else. So there's that. It's like, no, just give me one name, one. Yeah. So
no, absolutely. And I think actually mostly what he did was kind of just, in fact, because he wasn't trying to rhetorically crush Peterson's skull, I think that made it that much more devastating. That just to kind of put them side by side, right? Somebody who is as interesting and insightful as Zizek, and somebody who can be very rhetorically effective when he's on his game, but who is also kind of hysterical about these accusations about postmodern Marxism, and is really not bringing a lot to the table when you actually start to dig just a little bit under the surface, right? So actually, before we go to to questions, go a little bit into the ending conversation. I want to do one more clip in a minute that I think illustrates some of what I'm talking about and maybe ties together a couple of these threads, because I think that Peterson's pitch often, right, politically, is that he's going to appeal to some combination of maybe legitimate distaste that some of his fans have for a certain flavor of identitarian activism, also, frankly, appealing to some sexism and bad social attitudes that people also have, that that's the starting point, and he's going to take that and then use it to advance this general critique, and when I say he uses it, right, I mean, he's very sincere, right? I don't think there's any question that he's like pretending to believe any of this. I don't think he's claiming to believe that twine snake imagery in ancient artwork is the DNA double helix. I don't think he's pretending for clout to believe that, right? I think he's a sincere person. He's just severely misguided.
I'll give him this. I'll give him that on that point, though. I mean, most people would sit there and decide to back away from claiming that the ancients had actually anticipated the creation of DNA and had presented it in their art, but he doesn't shy away from it, right? He's not afraid of looking ridiculous if it's advantageous. Just before I play the clip, though, I wanted to say I don't think that's a hypothetical. That one of the reasons he was so appealing was he was talking to an audience that really dislikes certain forms of identitarian activism. Maybe this is the same for you, maybe not, but the number one criticism of the book that I get runs something to the effect of, yeah, you make a lot of highfalutin arguments against his position, la-di-da-di-da, but nonetheless, he kind of expresses a higher truth about the way the left is. It's always less kind of vaguely defined, but the idea is basically, when you boil it down, that social justice warriors and identitarians are annoying, and because they're annoying, they must be a threat to our civilization. And when you try to respond to that, it's kind of like, well, what is there to say? It's not really an argumentative point. It's something more visceral. People feel in their bones that there's something wrong with this, and he speaks to that, right?
Yeah, absolutely, right. So I think probably the best way that we can respond to it is by doing three things, and I think we've both been trying to do them in this talk. So one might seem like the least significant, but I actually think it's pretty significant, is what Zizek was doing in Toronto and saying, hey, if you're being guided towards these reactionary kind of anti-left, socially regressive conclusions by your visceral distaste for this certain brand of leftism, let's show you a brand of leftism that you might have a different reaction to. Now, some people are just hopelessly misogynistic and politically reactionary, and there's no brand of leftism that's going to appeal to them. But a lot of people are just kind of confused, and so they can take that visceral distaste for certain brands of identity politics and be led where Peterson is leading them. But they could also say, oh, hey, here are these other people who I don't have that visceral distaste for, and who also want me to have healthcare and a good education and more power on the job, and a more equal society. That actually doesn't sound that bad, right? So that's the first thing that I think we could do, and something that I think the importance of which really can't be understated. The second thing that we can do is point out that, because he really rides on a lot of this vagueness, right? Like, he gets a lot of mileage often being very unclear what he's saying. So that's what this last clip that I want to do is there to illustrate. So the background here is, in fact, after Matt mentioned incels earlier, after a high-profile incident where an incel killed a bunch of people, Peterson's comment was that the solution to this sort of violence by sexually frustrated men was, and I quote, enforced monogamy. A lot of people had exactly the reaction you expect them to have to that, if you're a reasonable person. And then in this clip, he's responding to it and explaining why he thinks that reaction is unfair.
Okay. So the question is, what do you mean by enforced monogamy?
Well, we could start by what I don't mean. I don't mean taking innocent women at gunpoint and handing them over to useless men, which is essentially the accusation. And it was really interesting to watch that unfold. What I meant was that monogamy as something that's socially valued appears to be essentially a human universal. That doesn't mean that human beings are universally monogamous, because obviously we're not. We can be serially monogamous, and some people are players and have multiple partners and all of that. But there's a strong proclivity across known societies to tilt towards monogamy. And the enforcement is social norms. It's like, well, think about it. I can't believe that I even have to say this. Your son just gets married, and he comes home and he says, guess what, Dad? I've been screwing around. And what do? You pat him on the head and you say, hey, good work, kid. That's my young man. Right? Well, no, you're not happy about that. And he doesn't tell you because he knows you're not going to be happy about it. And that's enforced monogamy.
Yeah. And if you actually pause to think about that for a few seconds, that's a clarification that actually clarifies nothing. And it really goes to how much Peterson rides on vagueness and equivocation. Because you do this thing, right? It's this kind of Mott and Bailey strategy, right? What a Mott and Bailey is, the metaphor comes from medieval castles, right? The castle itself is the Mott. The Bailey is the courtyard outside. The Bailey is where you spend most of your time. But if attacked, you can always retreat to the Mott. So the rhetorical equivalent of this is making kind of wildly provocative statements, and when challenged on them, retreating to this extremely narrow construal of it. And the reason I like this example so much, and the reason I think this is a good one to push people on, you say, oh, okay, well, maybe he gets a few things wrong about Marxism and postmodernism and equality and hierarchy and evolution and, damn near every other subject he talks about. But he's got this deeper truth, about social conditions, about, forms of social progress that people who are saying this resent. This is a nice example. I say, okay, so you think people are being really unfair here. Well, what's the right explanation? And you'll notice that his explanation of what it means to enforce monogamy in the clip is that people disapprove of cheating on their partners. And the original context was that this is the solution to existing social problems, that because you currently have these, incel shootings, right? So something's clearly wrong. The solution is enforcing monogamy. Well, that suggests that we should be doing something we aren't already doing. And he never explains in that clip what it is that we should be doing that we aren't already doing. His example is something that we are already doing. And there are all kinds of things you could talk about in terms of rolling back the clock to the time that, if you were an unmarried couple trying to check into a hotel, you had to pretend to be married, or they wouldn't take you. So that would certainly be an example of kind of enforcement of monogamy that we don't have right now. But if he said that, it wouldn't work. That wouldn't be the Mott that he could retreat to at the end. So he's strident about it. He's kind of funny about it, but he keeps it incredibly vague. And this is finally going to get into the third thing that I think we can do.
I should say, though, actually, that disjunction that you're talking about is really characteristic of right-wing rhetorical stances generally, because there's always this kind of implication once that there's a standard and norm that everyone accepts, accompanied by a narrative decline that's almost implicit in the rhetoric, right? That this is all collapsing. A lot of people don't believe this any longer. And there's never really a very deep interrogation of why it is that everybody holds on to this norm. At the same time, almost everybody now seems to be abandoning it in droves. Because it can't be the problem with the norm itself, because that's what we want to preserve. It can't be like there was some kind of problem with the existing status quo. So it has to be some kind of moral failing on the part of the people who are deviating from it. And this gives way to all kinds of panic and anxieties. And just on the point that you make about the Mott and Bailey, he does this an awful lot, and it's really frustrating. A good example would be in the clip that we played a few minutes earlier, where he was talking about being a psychologist, right? Whenever people press him on some of his political comments and the kind of reactionary dimension to them, a lot of times his response will just be something to the effect of, well, I'm just a psychologist, so I'm not actually trying to make a political point. What I'm trying to do is teach people individually how to be better. In which case you might also ask, well, why all this stuff about postmodern neo-Marxists and the evils of equality of opportunity and so on and so forth, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, this is something lots of people do. John Oliver does this, right? When it's convenient, he's taking political swings. When it's inconvenient, hey man, I'm just a comedian, right? This is just jokes. But on the other hand, Peterson isn't a slightly annoying late night TV comedian. He's somebody who presents himself as an authority on how people should live their lives, on politics, certainly. As you say, the dangers of equality of outcome, of postmodern Marxism, of trying to get rid of hierarchy. And so for him to do this is a little bit more outrageous, than for people to do it in these other categories. But I really like the last thing you said, because that does bring me to the third and last point that I wanted to make about how to respond to what you're talking about, right? That when people say, okay, sure, you've shown me 50 or 75 things that Peterson gets wrong, in the book, but there's this basic thing that I think underneath it all he gets right, and he's presenting it in a really compelling way, and that's good enough for me, right? So, one of those things, is that we can do to respond to that is try to present a version of the left that doesn't inspire the same level of visceral dislike from people likely to be influenced by Peterson. The second thing we can do is really press into the details on some of these claims that he's making about social progress. But the third thing that we can do, and this is something that in your presentation you got at a little bit, but I think as we kind of start to wrap up, it's really worth putting a bow on because it's a really important point, which is addressing better the underlying thing that he's talking about. And when I say the underlying thing that he's talking about, I don't mean some leftists being annoying and censorious and driving people away from the left. That's a problem, right? But that's not the underlying problem. The underlying problem that Peterson is talking about is the conditions of extreme atomization and alienation that make what he's saying plausible to people in the first place, that make people turn towards somebody like him in the first place. Because before you even get to the point of blaming nefarious feminists and college kids promoting postmodern, neo-Marxism for what ails you, something has to be ailing you in the first place. And it is true, a lot of what he says, that there has been a certain breakdown of certain kinds of traditional social institutions. That's not all bad. Some of those institutions were oppressive, and we don't want to turn back the clock, right? Like in the example that I just gave about the hotel rooms. But it's also true that fewer people are currently able to hold together long-term relationships, have kids, etc. That there has been a decline in those things. And so the fact that, and this is something Zizek talks about in his introduction to the book, the fact that Peterson says false things, right, isn't really what makes him so dangerous. It's that he couches them in true things, right? The ailment is real. It's just the cure that where it gets goofy and reactionary.
Yeah, I completely agree. And actually, I guess before we take questions, I'll just say my last two pieces on this. One is that I think you're absolutely right, and we have to respond to these figures. One of the criticisms that we got for the book that I thought was a bit odd is people said, well, if you try to convince the left that they need to learn from Peterson's example, aren't you just allowing them to basically push you around to say what it is that you should do and how it is that you should be? My response is no. It's kind of like playing a game of chess. If you're responding to an opponent or a competitor by trying to play the game better, you're not allowing them to push you around. You're trying to win the game, and that means you need to be responsive to what they've said. And that's the kind of superficial tactical metaphor that I usually use when it comes to dealing with people like this. On the deeper point, I completely agree, right? I think that we live in a highly unjust society. We've seen levels of inequality skyrocket, and this has actually created a lot of animosity on the part of the body politic. That's entirely understandable. And people are looking for somewhere to blame all these kinds of problems on. And it shouldn't be a surprise that somebody like Peterson or a lot of these other IDW types are coming along with convenient answers for that. And on the political left, we need to do better at addressing these kinds of concerns. And I think there's a lot of things that we can talk about on that point. And I think one of the ways that we can do that is by saying, if you feel kind of shitty and alienated and you're angry, that's entirely understandable, but translate those kind of energies into pushing for things like better healthcare, better job conditions, a fairer, more democratic workplace, equality for your spouse. All these kinds of things are really down to earth human concerns that are actually achievable in the current political condition. And they'll provide you with a lot longer and a lot more meaningful satisfaction than just blaming so-called postmodern neo-Marxists and college-age student activists for your problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Like one way to maybe kind of like close out, right, by putting a finer point on this, is that, you know, postmodern academics aren't actually that powerful, right? They don't really, you know, they don't really control the larger economic structure of society, certainly. Yeah. You know, and
I saw this really funny meme once that was like, the political right is convinced that I control the world. Experience has taught me that I can't even convince my students to read 50 pages of Derrida every single week. And it's like, yeah. No,
that's exactly right. And, you know, the reason that, you know, that people are, for example, unlikely maybe, you know, in certain cases to have an easy time holding together long-term relationships, or, you know, don't do things like buy a house, start having kids, is not primarily because of, you know, of anything that like any feminist or trans activist has done, much less the mythological postmodern Marxists that he's railing against. What he's reacting to, and this is really worth highlighting, because when he does talk about economics, he is a uncritical celebrator of free markets, right? You know, he will say things like, we should have markets that are as free as possible. But what he's, you know, the reason that that people have less free time, that they're that they have more stress in their lives, all of these things that you know, that they move around a lot, right? All of these things that lead to the breakdown of what he's talking about, is not anything that anybody's doing at a university. It's neoliberal capitalism. It's precisely that unrestrained market forces, you know, are such that, you know, that we're less likely to have strong unions, a good regulatory state, never mind a post-capitalist society, all of these things that would actually enforce giving people a decent standard of living, so they're not constantly worried about, you know, losing their job, getting a second job, having to move, doing all of these things that can make it difficult to pursue the kind of traditional lifestyle that he wants to. And really, I think that, although of course we don't share in his nostalgia, right? You know, that we don't think that, you know, we don't want to go back to Leave It to the Beaver world. But I think what we can say is that we want to have a society where everybody is economically freed up to live however the hell they want to. That if, you know, if you want to, I don't know, be a devout Hindu and have a very traditional nuclear family, great, do it, right? If you want to live in a polyamorous Wiccan compound, great, do that, you know, do that, right? But the point is that everybody should have their basic needs met, have a certain amount of control over their lives, so that instead of, for example, staying with somebody that they would have moved out years ago, but they're worried about losing their health insurance, they're worried about whether they'd even be able to make rent on their own, or conversely being unable to hold together a relationship because of financial stress and anxiety, people are actually free in practice to live however they want to live.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as tempting as it might be to accept the right-wing narrative that every time you want to have heterosexual sex, Judith Butler just comes in the room and says, like, no, you can't, we need to interrogate this closely. There are probably more realistic factors at play to explain why it is that people can't live the kind of lives they want, right? Like all the ones that you're talking about. So I know that we got a lot of questions right now, so why don't we take on some of those, since I think you have to go at 7:30, right?
I might actually have to go earlier than that. So I have so I am right after this. I'm going on Katie Halper's YouTube to talk to her and Nanda Vila and Daniel Bessner about Marx, actually. So it ties in very nicely. But I'm going to be on the lookout for that.
So Ben, you feel free to jump off when you got to jump off, but we can start some of the questions that
Sure.
I think are kind of representative of the general field that we're getting from people right now. So the first one that I wanted to read is from BBQ Nice, who writes, "The center and right appropriate the left's ideas all the time. How do we avoid alienating fans of popular things?" He lists things like religion, kind of patriotism, America, or certain consumer goods, luxury goods like Corvettes. How do we avoid alienating fans of popular things as we seek to make them socialists?
I think the answer there is pretty simple, actually. A lot of the left can be very tempted to give into what's sometimes called a moralistic critique, right? That the problem with capitalism is it's a highly consumeristic society where people don't appreciate the good values of sociability and so on and so forth. And we should convince people to change their behavior. And I actually think the way to approach advocating for left-wing positions will be to talk about how it is that, as Bhaskar likes to say, 5 minutes after capitalism ends, we're going to have a much better society that's nonetheless contiguous with what we had before. So as Ben was saying, if you want to live a life that's dedicated to consumeristic hedonism, then that'll be available to a lot more people under a social constitution. If you want to live a life that's dedicated to forms of spiritual interrogation and religious self-abnegation, that'll also be available to you. It's really about allowing you the choice to live the kind of life that you want, rather than trying to imply that there's one right moral outlook that you need to embrace, and that anyone who doesn't agree with that deserves to be reprimanded. And I think that one of the problems we have with the left right now is that people often look at us as being Puritans in some way, shape, or form, right? That we want everyone to be the same, when really we want everyone to have the opportunity to fulfill their own vision of the good life, whatever that might happen to be.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. I would also add on the question, some of the questions about national identity, patriotism, nationalism. That there are some complicated political issues there. But I also think that whatever you think about how we should navigate some of those things, that in other words, like how to be good internationalists and tell people, which we should, right, that they have more in common with poor and working people in other countries than they do with Jeff Bezos, is an American, and the people who work in his sweatshops in other countries are not, right? But that doesn't mean you have more in common with him than with them, and how to present that vision in an appealing and non-alienating way can get complicated. But I also think that there are some people on the left who make it much harder than it needs to be by sort of having this default position of reacting against anything that even sort of smacks of association with those things when we really don't need to, right? Or like when oftentimes certain pieces of history, for example, are complicated and they contain elements that we would celebrate, and they contain elements that we certainly wouldn't, right? That rather than emphasizing the stuff that we would and tying that into a positive program, the reaction is all too often as kind of angry moral condemnation of the whole thing, right? So just as a quick example of what I'm talking about, a really obvious case to me is leftists who every year on the 4th of July will post things on social media about how the American Revolution was actually bad, because there's a bunch of slave owners and this and that and the other thing. And of course, not everything they're saying is wrong, right? Like they are latching on to some real aspects of the history. But one, it's not necessary to be an antisocial weirdo about it, right? You can enjoy some fireworks, with your family and eat some hot dogs and, and drink a little whiskey and, be happy, right? And two, I think that rather than saying it that way, right? There's a very nice passage in one of Michael Harrington's memoirs where he talks about how if we want to change America because we hate it, right, people will pick up on that and they'll want nothing to do with us. To be a socialist in a more serious sense has to be about seeing the kind of society we could potentially become in the future. His phrase is "seeing the seed beneath the snow," which is a nice flourish. But I think you could say, look, the way that we react to think about the American Revolution or the Haitian Revolution or any of these other classical democratic revolutions shouldn't certainly be to whitewash the aspects of the history that deserve to be critiqued, but it should be to say that what socialism can potentially be is a fulfillment of the best and most defensible ideals of those revolutions. And I think that's both accurate, and I'm going to have to jump off here, leave it to you and Kale to finish out. But I think not only is that accurate, it's just a unfathomably more politically appealing message.
Yeah, I think so too. And actually, this is one of the reasons why I sometimes like to point out that I think one of the biggest disadvantages we on the left have kind of given to ourselves is by being relentlessly and kind of hiply critical of everything liberalism stands for. When if you actually ask the average leftist, do you believe in things like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of association? The road answer is yes, absolutely. If anything, we should have more respect for all of those things. And that's why I often say, if you look at the liberal tradition in a lot of Occidental countries, there's plenty to build upon there if you want to make the argument for socialism. And rather than fighting against those trends and say that we're going to enact some kind of radical break with the past that none of you can imagine, it's much more sensible to take the kind of argument that people like Bhaskar do and say that, listen, we're going to do something that's contiguous with what's happened before. We're just going to take the best elements that you find in your society and in the liberal tradition, and we're going to push them further to genuinely create a society where everyone's valued as a moral equal, and everyone has a fair shot at leading a decent life, however it is that they conceptualize that. Right?
Exactly.
And I can't think of anything more American or Canadian or whatever you want to call it than that, right?
Yep.
Yeah, that's perfect. Thanks again, Ben. Have a good show with Katie and Nando and all of our comrades over there. Thank you for giving us so much of your time tonight, and as always. And Matt and I will continue a couple more questions before we sign off.
Sounds good. Thanks, Kale.
We'll grab a drink some night, Brad.
Cool. Okay, so another one I wanted to get to, it's by Scalamander. Loving the screen names. He asks, or she asks, or whoever asks, Matt and Ben, now just Matt, is the Peterson phenomenon a symptom of the weakness of the right or the weakness of the left, or both? Or, and maybe, I don't know if that's supposed to be the strength of the right or the weakness of the right, but regardless, how could we socially determine the causation in why the Peterson phenomenon is such a phenomenon, why it exists in society in this moment?
I don't think it's symptomatic of anything directly political, actually. I kind of changed the parameters of the question. A lot of people are talking about how we're living in a time of what's sometimes called realignment. So the left and the right are kind of changing their kind of ideological opinions and values and moving towards new kinds of policies and new approaches to politics that haven't been seen before. And usually when you see times of realignment, it's because there's a lot of uncertainty in the world and people are open to new ideas while at the same time feeling kind of anxious about what the future might hold. And in that kind of environment, somebody like Jordan Peterson, who talks a lot about order and chaos and the fundamental structure of existence and what's ultimately of meaning to people, can have a lot of currency. And I don't think it's a surprise that he can have a lot of currency, since he offers some pretty rhetorically compelling answers to a lot of people's anxieties on these issues. And I think what we need to do on the political left, if we're going to be successful, is try to provide not just equally rhetorically compelling answers, but better and more democratic and egalitarian ones. And there's a lot of places that we can start. Ben and I talked a little bit about that at the end. And I'd be happy to elaborate on that a little bit further. But that's the way that I would approach it. It's not necessarily political so much as indicatory of deeper tensions within our society as it stands right now at the crest of the postmodern epoch.
So couldn't the counterfactual be that if we lived in a society that had left political institutions, left working class parties, civil society associations and groups and clubs, and most importantly, a strong labor movement, a vibrant union culture and union activity, that, of course, it's an impossible counterfactual in some sense, but we would make the argument that a society that looks more like that would mean that arguments that Peterson's putting out wouldn't be as relevant or wouldn't be as acceptable, or they would just kind of be shelved over to the corner of self-help, that maybe wouldn't occupy politics as much.
Absolutely. And I mean, one of the things that I often point out, and Slavoj Žižek talks about this with great eloquence as well, is post-1989, a lot of people have felt politically powerless. We were told that we lived at the end of history, that more or less all the big ideological questions of meaning and value had been settled in favor of neoliberalism. And our job was just to become good neoliberal subjects and express our identity through various forms of conspicuous consumption. And I think a lot of people weren't satisfied with that, and it wasn't a very stable way of looking at the world. And we're starting to see the cracks in the edifice right now. And that's because people fundamentally want the social and democratic freedom to remake their world. And if they don't get it, then they're going to look for people who took it away from them. And for many people on the political right, the people who took away their democratic freedom are liberal elites and their allies in universities and immigrants and all these different people on the left who undermined the way things should be and took power away from the common, by which they mean conservative man. And we need to put a better narrative forward as leftists and say, no, the reason why it is that you feel powerless is precisely because of the things that you're talking about. Unions have declined, workplace democracy has declined, the labor movement has been gutted precisely by these kinds of reforms. Restoring those would be a good step to making you feel like you have a certain kind of social freedom. And then what we also need is a genuinely emancipatory polity that's focused on people's everyday needs, like providing universal healthcare, good education, a life of opportunity and flourishing for yourself and your family. And all these things have been really in short supply for the last couple of decades. And I think that's why we're starting to see left-wing parties make some headway again. And we really want to see more of that.
Yeah, I think that's really well said. For the people in the comments who are asking about my messy bed, it's a mise en scène, if you will, for tonight's episode. So I have another question from the sports leader who is asking, what would you, Matt, advise people persuaded by this talk to watch next after this? I'll just very briefly plug that on Friday at 6 p.m. we're going to have a talk called Why You Should Be a Marxist by frequent Jacobin contributor Paul Heidemann. It's basically going to be laying out kind of the foundations of a materialist analysis, kind of the existing relevance of a Marxist analysis, and trying to kind of take it out of the camp of dogmatism of, well, this is what Marx said, to this is an actual scientific theory and analysis to approach the world and try to make predictions about how we think society and political economy work. So that would be my plug. Of course, we should also plug the article that you and Ben wrote in Jacobin, the same title as this, and the book that's out right now from Zero Books that you're a co-author on. But aside from all the most obvious plugs that we have to do, where would you advise people to go next after this?
Well, I think there's a lot of great leftist work that's being done right now, some of which is extremely original and very inspiring in ways that we haven't seen for a long time. Arguably, I'd say since the 1960s, when a lot of these so-called postmodern neo-Marxists got their start. If you're looking for some good bread tubers that I enjoy, you can always check out the Zero Books website. Our editor, Douglas Lane, produces just an unbelievable number of videos every single week on topics related from high theory to pop culture to contemporary political events. And I always find him really insightful and funny. And certainly he's got some pretty cool personal anecdotes that kind of bring things down to earth and can make you laugh if that's what you're looking for. I also think other bread tubers like ContraPoints, who I already mentioned, are really good. I like people like Cut Philosophy or Philosophy Tube. And I really am pretty happy to see this emerging just because the political right had such a monopoly on YouTube for many, many years. If you're looking for writers that I think are insightful, it really depends on what you're looking for, since the breadth of left-wing writing is vast, and everyone kind of takes on a different niche. I think people like Ben are doing really good work bringing complicated philosophical topics down to earth. I also like people like Nathan Robinson, the editor of Current Affairs. I think he's really funny. He does a tremendous job deconstructing a lot of different conservative arguments, including Peterson's, I should say, in a way that's accessible, never uses pretentious language, and can be pretty witty at points also. I also really like, a variety of different comedians. I actually like John Oliver, contra Ben. Some of these people have problems with them. They sometimes are a little bit too liberal for my taste. But it's nice to see that they're at least addressing the problems with things like Trumpism and doing that in a way that's funny and that seems to inspire a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that's right. And that's in part kind of the aspiration of doing this right now, of creating the Jacobin YouTube channel, of doing more popular political education and trying to make it interactive, that hopefully we can try to have these conversations among kind of contributors, but also viewers, readers, because, and putting it in language that is, colloquial, that's like commonplace, that's not academic, that if anything, we're like, at least my aspiration, I won't put any words in Boskar's mouth or anyone else, but we need to take the left out of academia, out of middle-class institutions, and make this as accessible and as inclusive to working class people as possible. And just on that,
absolutely do. I just want to make one last plug, because this is really, I think, important for an academic actually to kind of counter, that. If anybody has a chance, they should check out Wendy Brown's "In the Ruins of Neoliberalism." It's actually a pretty down-to-earth book. It's written by, I think, the greatest political commentator of our time, working at an academic institution. And it's a tremendously rich and provocative analysis of the world that we live in right now. And if there's any justice in the world, it would sell more copies than Harry Potter. So In the Ruins of Neoliberalism, people should definitely check that out.
Great. And one final plug I'll say is that someone who's done videos for us already, actually, on the Jacobin YouTube channel, if you're new to the left or you want a really kind of good kind of articulation of what is the basic left critique of capitalism, how do we understand capitalism, which is effectively what Marxism is the science of understanding capitalism, but we also try to understand it in order to actually change it. And I think one of our kind of greatest thinkers and writers on this right now is Vivek Chibber, and he's written a number of pamphlets that you can get from the Jacobin website. You can download PDFs from the website. We have 3 lectures of his that I encourage people to check out, just called The ABCs of Capitalism. On that note, Matt, I want to thank you again so much. I want to thank Ben, wherever Ben is in the world right now. I presume Atlanta. And again, for people watching, we do these shows throughout the week. We have another one on Friday, and we also have a show on Saturday, weekends, with Anna Kasparian and Nanda Vila, with guest Lee Phillips, talking about COVID and the market's inability to properly address this crisis. As I think we're only going to see, it's only going to kind of show how horrible, like or really just how inept it is at actually dealing with public health crises as we move forward, as we anticipate a vaccine and kind of the whole fiasco that's going to come along with that, I'm sure. But again, thank you, Matt. Thank you to everyone watching. Please hit like, please hit subscribe. Please share the stream and the video with friends and family. And everyone, have a good night.
Yeah, thanks a lot for having me on. Jacobin's one of my favorite magazines, and it was a real pleasure. So cheers.
Thank you.